I arrived at the Christmas dinner with a cast on my foot and a voice recorder in my pocket. Everyone stared at me in dismay when I told them that my daughter-in-law had purposefully shoved me. My son laughed in my face and said I deserved that lesson. What they did not know was that I had spent 2 months preparing my revenge, and that night, every single one of them would receive exactly what they deserved. But before I continue, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love to know how far our stories are reaching. My name is Sophia Reynolds. I am 68 years old, and I learned the hardest way possible that trust is earned, not given away for free, just because someone was born from your womb. It all started 3 years ago when my husband, Richard, passed away from a sudden, fatal heart attack. It was 35 years of marriage, 3 decades building a life together, a bakery business that grew into a small chain with 4 locations in New York City. Richard was the love of my life, my partner in everything. When he left, I felt as if half of me had been ripped away. My only son, Jeffrey, showed up at the wake with his wife, Melanie, and he hugged me too tight, for too long. At the time, I thought it was comfort. Today, I know it was calculation. They lived in a rented apartment in a neighborhood far from me, and they would come to visit maybe once a month. But after the burial, they started showing up every week. Jeffrey insisted that I could not stay alone in the big house in Brooklyn. He said he was worried about my mental health, about my safety. Melanie agreed with everything, always with that sweet smile that I had not yet learned to read as fake. I resisted at first, but the loneliness weighed heavily. The house that was once full of life with Richard now echoed empty. So I gave in. That is how, 4 months after becoming a widow, Jeffrey and Melanie moved into my house. They brought their things little by little, occupying the guest room, then using the garage for her car, and eventually spreading belongings to every corner of the house, as if it had always been theirs. At first, I confess it was comforting. To have someone in the house, to hear voices, to feel movement. Jeffrey cooked for me on weekends. Melanie accompanied me to the farmer's market. It seemed like I had recovered part of the family I lost with Richard's death. I was a fool. The inheritance Richard left was considerable. Besides the house, which was worth over $2 million, there were the 4 well-functioning bakeries, generating monthly profits and robust savings he had built over the years. In total, the assets were around $4 million. Jeffrey was my only heir, but as long as I was alive, everything was mine. The first request for money came 6 months after they moved in. Jeffrey approached me one Sunday afternoon while I was watering the garden plants. He had that expression I had known since he was a child, when he wanted something but pretended to be embarrassed to ask for it. He told me that the company where he worked was going through restructuring and that he might be laid off. He needed $50,000 to invest in a specialization course that would guarantee him a better position. As a mother, how could I refuse? I transferred the money the next day. 3 weeks later, it was Melanie who showed up in my suite, all apologetic, saying that her mother had health problems and needed $30,000 for a specific surgery. I paid without question. After all, we were family now. The requests began to multiply. In September, another $40,000 for an investment Jeffrey swore would double in 6 months. In October, $25,000 to fix Melanie's car after an accident. In November, another $30,000 for an unmissable partnership opportunity in a business that never materialized. By the time December arrived, I had already lent $230,000, and I saw no sign of return. Every time I brought up the subject, Jeffrey would deflect, promise that we would resolve it soon, or simply change the conversation. I started to notice a pattern. They always asked when I was alone, always with stories that generated guilt or urgency. It was a Sunday morning when everything changed. I woke up early, as always, and went down to make coffee. The house was still silent. I put the water on to boil, and that is when I heard voices coming from their bedroom. The hallway amplified the sound in a strange way, and I managed to hear every word with disturbing clarity. Melanie's voice came first, too casual for what she was saying. She asked when I was going to die. Just like that, directly, as if she were asking what time it was. I felt my body freeze. Jeffrey let out a nervous laugh and asked her not to talk like that. But Melanie continued, relentless. She said I was 68 and could easily live another 20 or 30 years, that they could not wait that long, that they needed to find a way to speed things up, or at least ensure that when I died, everything would go directly to them without complications. My hand trembled so much that I almost dropped the mug I was holding. I stood there, paralyzed next to the stove, while my son and my daughter-in-law discussed my death as if it were a logistical problem to be solved. Jeffrey mumbled something about me being his mother, but with no real conviction. Melanie replied bluntly. She asked how much money they had already taken from me. Jeffrey replied that it was around 200,000, maybe a little more, and Melanie said they could still get another 150,000 before I suspected anything. After that, she started talking about the will, about the power of attorney, about the possibility of having me sign papers that would guarantee their control over my finances before I became senile. She used that word, senile, as if it were inevitable, as if it were only a matter of time. I went upstairs back to my room with shaky legs. I locked the door for the first time since they had moved in. I sat on the bed I shared with Richard for so many years and cried in silence. I did not cry from physical pain, but from the pain of realizing that my only son saw me as a financial obstacle, that the woman he chose to marry was even worse, cold and calculating to the point of planning my death with the naturalness of someone planning a vacation. That Sunday morning was the day Sophia Reynolds died. The naive woman who believed in family above all else, who blindly trusted her son, who saw goodness where there was only greed. She died there, on that empty bed, and in her place, another Sophia was born, one who knew how to defend herself, one who would not allow anyone else to treat me like an idiot, and that new Sophia was about to show Jeffrey and Melanie that they had chosen the wrong victim. I spent the following days observing. I did not confront them. I did not let on that I knew anything. I remained the same old Sophia in front of them. The loving mother, the attentive mother-in-law, the lonely widow who depended on both of their company. But inside I was piecing together a puzzle. I started paying attention to details that had gone unnoticed before. The way Melanie always appeared in the living room when the mailman brought correspondence from the bank. How Jeffrey would look away when I mentioned the bakeries. The whispers that abruptly stopped when I entered a room. Everything began to make sense, a sinister and painful sense. I decided I needed to understand the extent of the problem. I scheduled a meeting with Robert Morris, the accountant who had managed the bakery's finances since Richard's time. I made up some excuse about an end-of-year review and went alone to his office downtown. Robert was a serious man, about 60 years old, who always handled our business with discretion and efficiency. When I asked him to review all financial movements of the last year, both personal and corporate, he frowned but did not question. What I discovered in the next 3 hours made me want to vomit. In addition to the $230,000 that I had consciously loaned, there were regular withdrawals from the bakery's account that I had not authorized. Small amounts, 2,000 here, 3,000 there, always on Thursdays when I had my yoga class, and Jeffrey was in charge of signing some company documents. Robert pointed to the computer screen with a grave expression. He explained that in total, over the last 10 months, $68,000 had been diverted from the business accounts, always with my digital signature, which Jeffrey had access to as the authorized agent I had naively appointed to help me after Richard's death. I felt my blood boil. It was not just the loaned money that might never return. It was pure and simple theft, a systematic diversion of amounts that they thought I would not notice because I trusted them to help manage the businesses. I asked Robert to do two things immediately: cancel any and all power of attorney Jeffrey had over my accounts and businesses, and prepare a detailed report of all suspicious transactions. He suggested I consider filing a police report, but I asked him to wait. I did not know exactly how I was going to deal with it yet, but I wanted to have all the information first. Back home, I stopped at a coffee shop and sat there for over an hour, drinking tea that went cold without me touching it. My head was spinning with plans, with rage, with sadness. $298,000. That was the total Jeffrey and Melanie had stolen from me, between never repaid loans and diversions from the businesses. But the money, I realized, was not even the worst part. The worst part was the betrayal. The worst part was looking at the son I raised, whom I hugged, whom I taught to walk, and knowing that he saw me as a source of income, that he was waiting for me to die, that he was laughing at me behind my back while faking affection. When I arrived home that afternoon, they were in the living room watching television. Melanie greeted me with her usual fake smile and asked if I wanted something special for dinner. Jeffrey commented that I looked tired, showing concern like the devoted son he pretended to be. I told them I was fine, just a slight headache, and went up to my room. But before going upstairs, I turned around and looked at them both. I really looked, perhaps for the first time since they moved in. I saw the way Melanie snuggled on the couch as if she owned the house, how Jeffrey had his feet propped up on the coffee table that Richard had bought on a trip we took upstate, how they occupied the space that was mine, that I built, as if it were already theirs by right. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I was not going to simply kick them out or confront them directly. That would be too easy, too fast. They had spent months manipulating me, stealing from me, planning my end. They deserved something more elaborate. They deserved a taste of their own medicine. I started my investigation the next day. While Jeffrey was at work and Melanie was out meeting friends, I ransacked their bedroom. I know it was an invasion of privacy, but at that point, I did not care about such moral subtleties. I found interesting things. A folder with copies of my old will, where I left everything to Jeffrey. Notes about the estimated value of the house and the bakeries. Screenshots of conversations in a group chat called Plan S, where Melanie discussed with friends the best ways to obtain a power of attorney from elderly people. A friend of hers had recommended a lawyer specialized in that, but what shocked me the most was a notebook Melanie kept hidden in the lingerie drawer. It was a diary where she noted strategies to manipulate me. It had things written like, "Sophia gets more emotional and generous after talking about Richard. Use that." Or, "Always ask for money when I am alone with her. Jeffrey gets in the way by being weak." I read that with a mixture of horror and rage. Every page was proof of how Melanie had studied my behavior, my weaknesses, to better exploit me. She even noted the times I went out, the friends I saw, as if she were keeping surveillance. I took photos of everything with my cell phone. Every page of the notebook, every document in the folder, every screenshot of the conversation. I saved everything in a hidden folder on my computer and a copy in the cloud. If they wanted to play dirty, they would find out I could too. In the following days, I kept my normal routine, but with hawk eyes. I noticed Melanie going through my mail when she thought I was not looking. I saw Jeffrey making whispered calls on the balcony. I saw the two of them exchanging meaningful glances whenever I mentioned anything about my health. One night, during dinner, Melanie casually brought up that a friend of hers had taken her mother to a very good geriatrician who specialized in memory loss. She said it was important to get preventative checkups at my age. Jeffrey agreed too quickly, suggesting I schedule an appointment. I pretended to consider the idea, but inside I was laughing. They were trying to plant the seed of the idea that I was becoming senile, creating a narrative to eventually declare me incompetent. It was exactly the kind of move I had read in Melanie's notebook. That is when I had an idea. If they wanted to make me look like an idiot, I was going to play the part perfectly. I would give them exactly what they expected. A confused, vulnerable, increasingly dependent old lady. And while they thought they were winning, I would be building my trap. I started slowly. I pretended to forget small things. I would ask the same question twice. I would leave the pot on the stove longer than usual. Nothing too obvious, just enough to feed their narrative. Melanie took the bait immediately. She started commenting to Jeffrey, loud enough for me to hear, about my confusions. Jeffrey also joined the game, suggesting that perhaps I needed help managing the bakery's accounts because it was becoming too complicated for me. On the outside, I nodded, feigning self-concern. Inside, I was documenting everything. I recorded conversations, noted dates and times, and saved evidence. Every move they made was being recorded, every word was being archived. I also discreetly hired a private investigator. I wanted to know exactly what Jeffrey and Melanie were doing when they were not home, who they were talking to, and where they were going. The detective, an ex-cop named Mitch, was efficient and discreet. 2 weeks later, Mitch brought me a report that confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed things I had not even imagined. Mitch met me at a coffee shop far from my neighborhood, away from any possibility of running into Jeffrey or Melanie. He carried a thick folder and an expression that mixed professionalism with pity. That already told me the news would not be good. The report started with the basics: Jeffrey and Melanie's routine, places they frequented, and people they met. But it quickly became clear that much more was going on than I had imagined. First, the apartment. They had not cancelled the old lease as they claimed. In fact, they had renewed the contract and used the place regularly, several times a week. Mitch had photos of them entering and leaving, always carrying expensive shopping bags, imported wine bottles, and boxes from sophisticated restaurants. Essentially, they were living in my house for free, eating my food, using my facilities, but keeping the apartment as a secret retreat where they indulged in a luxury lifestyle with the money they were stealing from me. The hypocrisy left me breathless. But there was more. Mitch had discovered that Melanie did not work, contrary to what she always implied. The outings to meet clients were actually afternoons at spas, expensive hair salons, and luxury malls. She was spending my money getting pampered as if she were a society lady, while I, the true owner of the fortune, lived modestly. The report also revealed frequent meetings with a man named Julian Perez. He was a lawyer specializing in family and probate law, particularly in cases of legal incapacitation and guardianship of the elderly. Mitch had managed to confirm, through a source at the firm, that Melanie had consulted Julian about the procedures for obtaining legal guardianship over someone deemed incompetent. I felt my stomach churn. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively preparing the ground to strip me of all legal control over my own life. They wanted to turn me into a legal prisoner, unable to make decisions, while they administered my fortune freely. Mitch turned another page, and his tone became even more serious. He had discovered something about Melanie's past that Jeffrey probably did not know. Before marrying my son, Melanie had been married to a 72-year-old gentleman for only 11 months. The man had died of natural causes and had left her a considerable inheritance. At the time, the deceased's family tried to contest the will, claiming that Melanie had manipulated the elderly man, but they failed to prove anything. She walked away with almost $500,000 clean. 2 years later, she met Jeffrey on a dating app. A young man, the only son of a rich widow. The coincidence was too unsettling to ignore. I was not dealing with a common opportunist daughter-in-law. I was dealing with someone who had experience in manipulating older people to obtain inheritances. Someone who had practically turned it into a profession. And my son, my Jeffrey, was either a conscious accomplice or a useful tool in her hands. Mitch showed me photos of this Julian, a man in his 40s, well-dressed, with the air of someone who knows exactly how the system works and how to exploit it. Apparently, he had a history of helping families gain guardianship over elderly relatives, always for exorbitant fees. His firm specialized in this lucrative and morally questionable niche. I asked Mitch to continue investigating, especially focusing on any contact between Melanie and people from her first marriage and any suspicious financial movements. He agreed and promised to have more information in 2 weeks. I left that coffee shop with the report hidden in my purse and crystal clear clarity in my mind. Melanie was not simply an opportunistic freeloader who saw a chance and took it. She was a professional predator who had chosen my son and, through him, me, as deliberate targets. And Jeffrey, my own flesh and blood, had accepted that role, whether out of greed, weakness, or a combination of both. That night, I could not eat dinner with them. I faked a headache and went up early. But in reality, I stayed in my room analyzing every page of Mitch's report, connecting the dots, understanding the extent of the trap I had fallen into. They had a long-term plan. First, empty my accounts through loans and diversions. Second, create a narrative of mental decline. Third, use Julian to obtain legal guardianship. And then, with total control over my finances and person, turn me into an empty shell while they lived off my fortune until I died naturally. Or, who knows, with a little help. The memory of the conversation I overheard, about when I was going to die and if they could speed things up, gained a new, more sinister weight. With Melanie's history of a conveniently early dying elderly husband, it was not paranoia to consider that she might be planning something similar with me. I made a decision right there. I was not going to simply defend myself. I was going to counterattack. I was going to use every piece of information I had, every piece of evidence Mitch gathered, every mistake they made, to turn the tables completely. When I was done with them, Jeffrey and Melanie would understand the true meaning of messing with the wrong person. I started with the obvious, changing my will. I scheduled a meeting with my trusted lawyer, Dr. Arnold Turner, who had handled the bakery's legal matters for years. I went to his office on a day Jeffrey was traveling for work, and Melanie had supposedly gone to visit her mother, Dr. Arnold received me with his usual care, offering coffee and asking about my health. When I explained that I wanted to make significant changes to the will, he took paper and pen with an attentive expression. First, I removed Jeffrey as the universal heir. In his place, I divided my assets so that the bakeries and half the money would go to a charity foundation that helps underprivileged children. The house and the other half of the money would go to my nephew Ryan, my deceased sister's son, a serious and hard-working young man who always kept in touch with me without financial interest. Jeffrey would inherit only a symbolic amount of $100,000, enough so he could not contest the will claiming he was forgotten, but small enough to make my dissatisfaction clear. And I left an explanatory letter, sealed, to be opened only after my death, detailing the reasons for my decision. Dr. Arnold asked a few questions, making sure I was lucid and certain of the decision. I superficially explained that there had been trust issues without going into detail. He was professional enough not to insist, only ensuring that everything would be done according to the law and kept in absolute secrecy. I also took the opportunity to draw up a healthcare power of attorney, naming my best friend, Sarah, as the person responsible for making medical decisions for me if I became incapacitated. Any attempt by Melanie and Jeffrey to institutionalize me or medicate me against my will would now run into this legal barrier. I left the office feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. It was only the first step, but an important one. Now, even if the worst happened to me, they would not get what they wanted. All the planning, all the manipulation would be in vain. But I did not intend for the worst to happen. I intended to be alive and well to see their faces when they discovered they had lost everything. November arrived with that suffocating heat typical of Los Angeles. It had been almost 4 months since I discovered the truth about Jeffrey and Melanie, and I had used every day of that time to build my case against them. Mitch continued to bring me information. We discovered that Melanie was meeting regularly with Julian, the lawyer, always at the secret apartment they maintained. We even managed to get photos of them entering the building together and audio recordings that proved they were preparing documentation to request my incapacitation. In one of those recordings, I heard Julian explaining to Melanie that they needed medical evaluations to prove my mental decline. He suggested they manage to take me to a specific doctor, someone who worked with him and was willing to diagnose cognitive problems for an extra payment. It was blatant corruption, a well-orchestrated scheme to defraud the legal system. Melanie asked how long it would take. Julian replied that with the correct documents, including witness statements about my erratic behavior, they could have the guardianship approved in 2 or 3 months. From there, they would have total control over my finances and personal decisions. The coldness with which they discussed this, as if it were any ordinary business deal, sent shivers down my spine. But it also gave me clarity. I was not facing people with an ounce of conscience or remorse. I was facing criminals, pure and simple. I decided it was time to start closing the net. But I needed to do it strategically, without showing all my cards at once. I started with small tests. One Thursday, during dinner, I casually commented that I was thinking of selling one of the bakeries, the one that made the least profit, I said, to simplify my life. Jeffrey almost choked on his food. Melanie became visibly tense. They spent the entire meal trying to convince me it was a terrible idea, that I was confused, that the bakeries were my legacy and I would regret it. Their concern had nothing to do with me, of course. They were terrified of the idea that I would sell assets before they could gain control over them. I let the subject die down naturally, saying I would think about it more. But I observed how agitated they were in the following days. Melanie made urgent calls, probably to Julian. Jeffrey started questioning me more about my finances, disguised as a concerned son. 2 weeks later, I dropped another bombshell. I said I had scheduled a consultation with a lawyer to discuss updating my will. Their reaction was even more intense. They immediately asked which lawyer, why I thought it was necessary, and if anything was worrying me. I lied, saying it was just a routine review that Dr. Arnold had suggested. They insisted on going with me, to support me. I politely refused, saying I needed to do it alone, that it was important for me to maintain some independence in my decisions. That night, after I pretended to go to sleep, I sat in the dark corner of the hallway and listened to their argument in their room. They were panicking. Melanie was saying they needed to speed up the incapacitation process, that I was starting to do things that could compromise the plan. Jeffrey agreed, but seemed indecisive, worried if they would get enough evidence. Melanie then suggested something that chilled me to the bone. She said they might need to create some evidence, make me seem more confused than I really was. Jeffrey asked how. She replied that there were ways. Medications mixed in my food could cause temporary mental confusion. Small accidents could create the impression that I was losing physical and mental abilities. I listened to that and felt, for the first time, real fear. They were not just planning to rob me. They were willing to drug me, to hurt me, to deliberately destroy my health to achieve their goals. I went back to my room with shaky legs, and for the first time in months, I cried for real. I cried for the loss of the son I thought I had. I cried for my naivete in trusting them. But mainly I cried with rage, a deep, cold rage that settled in my chest and did not leave. The next day, I called Mitch and told him about the conversation. He became serious and said we needed to involve the police, that this had gone past the point of simple financial fraud to planning assault. But I asked him to wait. I had a better plan. If Melanie wanted to make me look confused, I would give her exactly that, but in a controlled, documented way that would eventually turn against her. I started playing the role of the old lady losing her mind, but in an exaggerated, almost theatrical way. I pretended to forget where I had put things, but then found them in obvious places in front of them. I would ask the same question twice in a row, but always about unimportant matters. I would leave lights on, doors open, empty pots on the stove. Nothing dangerous, but everything very visible. And most importantly, I documented everything. I installed hidden cameras in strategic points of the house, small, discrete ones that recorded everything in high definition and automatically saved to the cloud. Every movement they made, every conversation, every conspiratorial glance was being recorded. Melanie took the bait with veracity. She started inviting friends over, always when I was nearby doing something confusing. They would witness my forgetfulness, my disorganization, and Melanie would narrate everything with that fake voice of concern. I knew she was building her network of witnesses. What she did not know was that my cameras captured the conversations after I left. They captured Melanie, telling her friends that I was worse than I looked, that I could no longer take care of myself, that they would soon need to take legal action. They captured the laughter when they thought I could not hear, the comments about how good it would be when they had access to all the money. Jeffrey also entered the game, but in a different way. He started bringing documents home, papers from the bakeries that needed my signature. Only now he would check every signature of mine, comparing them with previous ones, looking for signs of trembling or uncoordination that he could use as proof of decline. So I started signing some things with a trembling hand on purpose. Other times, I signed perfectly. I wanted to create inconsistency, give them hope, but never total certainty. Watching them frustrated, trying to decipher my real state, was almost satisfying. But everything changed one afternoon in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. I had gone to the supermarket to do some shopping. Upon returning, with the bags in my hand, I climbed the 3 steps of the house entrance as I had done for 20 years. Only this time, I felt something push me from behind. It was not an accidental stumble. It was a deliberate, strong shove, with 2 hands placed flat on my back. I completely lost my balance. The bags flew, and I fell sideways onto the concrete steps. The pain was immediate and agonizing. I felt something snap in my right foot at the moment of impact. I screamed more out of shock than pain, and tried to turn around to see who had pushed me. It was Melanie. She was standing there, at the top of the stairs, with an expression that was not of fright or concern. It was cold satisfaction. Our eyes met for a second, and in that second, I saw everything. She had done it on purpose. She had deliberately shoved me, calculating that the fall would injure me. Before I could say anything, I heard quick footsteps. Jeffrey appeared, coming from inside the house. He looked at me lying there, looked at Melanie, and then did something that broke the last piece of my heart that still held hope for him. He laughed. It was not a nervous laugh of surprise. It was a genuine laugh, of approval, almost of pride. And then he said, with a voice I had never heard come out of my son's mouth, something that would be etched into my memory forever. It was to teach you a lesson, as you deserve. I lay there, sprawled on the steps, my foot throbbing with pain, looking at the man I gave birth to, carried for 9 months, raised with all the love I had, and heard him tell me that I deserved to be assaulted, that I deserved to be hurt, that it was a lesson. Melanie walked down the steps calmly, picked up the fallen bags, and went inside the house as if nothing had happened. Geoffrey stayed there for a second longer, the smile still on his face, before following his wife. They left me there. They did not call for help, did not offer support, did not show an ounce of remorse. They simply abandoned me at the entrance of the house with a broken foot, as if I were disposable trash. It was the neighbours who found me. Mrs. Martha, who lives 3 houses down, was returning from the pharmacy and saw me. She shouted for help, called her husband, and together they helped me into their car to take me to the hospital. On the way, with the pain pulsating in my leg and silent tears streaming down my face, I made a choice. That had been their last mistake, the mistake that would transform all my pain, all my rage, all my planning, into concrete action. They had crossed the line from psychological manipulation to physical violence, and that changed everything. In the emergency room, while waiting for attention, I called Mitch. I explained what had happened. He was silent for a moment, then asked if I was absolutely sure it had been on purpose. I replied that I was sure, that Melanie had pushed me on purpose and Geoffrey had approved it, saying it was a lesson I deserved. Mitch then said something that surprised me. He asked if there were cameras at the entrance of the house, and that is when I remembered. The external camera I had installed weeks ago, hidden in the balcony lamp, pointing exactly at the stairs. If it was working, it had recorded everything. The shove, the fall, their reaction, Geoffrey's words, everything. I asked Mitch to go to my house, with some excuse, and discreetly check if the camera had captured the incident. He said he would go immediately. 2 hours later, sitting in a wheelchair with my right foot in a cast up to the knee, I received a message from Mitch. Just 2 words and an emoji. We got it. The camera had worked perfectly. It had recorded Melanie looking around before shoving me, checking for witnesses. It had recorded the shove itself, deliberate and forceful. It had recorded my fall and my scream. And most importantly, it had recorded Geoffrey laughing and saying those monstrous words. It was irrefutable proof of intentional physical assault, and I intended to use every second of that recording to completely destroy their plans. The doctors said my foot was fractured in 2 places. I would need surgery to insert pins, followed by months of physical therapy. I stayed hospitalized that night for the surgery the next morning. Geoffrey and Melanie appeared at the hospital 2 hours later. Melanie brought flowers and an expression of concern that would have won an Oscar if she were an actress. Geoffrey held my hand and talked about how worried he was, how they had despaired when the neighbours told them about my fall. My fall, as if I had stumbled alone. I let them perform. I let Melanie stroke my hair and say she would take care of me during recovery. I let Geoffrey promise that he would not leave my side. And inside, I planned every detail of what would come next. Because in 2 days, it would be Christmas. And that would be a Christmas dinner none of us would ever forget. The surgery on my foot was successful, but painful. They placed 2 titanium pins and told me I would need to wear the cast for at least 6 weeks, followed by intense physical therapy. I was discharged on the afternoon of December 23rd, Christmas Eve. Melanie insisted on picking me up from the hospital, bringing a rented wheelchair and acting like the devoted daughter-in-law she never was. On the way home, she talked non-stop about how she had prepared my room, how she had bought special pillows to elevate my leg, how she would take care of every detail of my recovery. I barely nodded, letting the medication pain give me an excuse to stay silent. But I observed everything. The way she drove too fast around corners, causing my foot to hit the dashboard and hurt more. The glances she cast in the rearview mirror, not of concern, but of calculation. She was gauging my fragility, my dependence, seeing how far she could push me now that I was literally injured. When we arrived home, Jeffrey was waiting at the door. He helped me out of the car and into the wheelchair with careful gestures, but his eyes were empty. There was no love there, no genuine filial concern, just the performance of a role he had chosen to play. They settled me in the room, and Melanie brought soup. I did not eat. I said the hospital medication had taken away my appetite. The truth is, I did not trust anything that came from their hands. Not after the conversation I overheard about putting medication in my food. The soup could have been perfectly normal, but I was not going to take any chances. That night, alone in the room with the door locked, I called Mitch. He told me he had compiled all the camera recordings from the last 2 months. We had hours of material showing suspicious conversations, meetings with Julian, discussions about their plans, and most importantly, the crystal-clear recording of the assault on the stairs. I told him about my plan for Christmas dinner. He was silent for a moment, then asked if I was sure. This was going to blow up my family in a way that had no turning back. I replied that my family had blown up the moment my son laughed at my pain and said I deserved to be hurt. What I was going to do on Christmas was just to make it official. Mitch agreed to help. He said he would coordinate with the police, that we would need officers present at the right moment. He also contacted Dr. Arnold, my lawyer, and Robert, the accountant. Everyone needed to be aware of what was coming. On the 24th, Christmas Eve, the house was strangely tense. Melanie had excessively decorated everything, as if the amount of ornaments could create the illusion of a happy family. Jeffrey had bought an expensive turkey and imported wines. They were planning a big celebration, and I knew why. They thought they had won, that with my broken foot, physically dependent on them, more fragile and vulnerable than ever, they finally had me where they wanted. The assault had not just been gratuitous violence, it had been strategic, to make me an invalid, dependent, easier to control. What they did not know was that they had only accelerated their own destruction. On Christmas morning, Melanie came into my room all cheerful. She said they had prepared a special lunch, that they had even invited some people. I asked her who. She listed the names, some friends of hers, the same ones who came to witness my supposed moments of confusion, and surprisingly, Julian, the lawyer. I felt a chill. They were going to use Christmas, with witnesses present, to create another episode of my supposed incompetence. They probably planned a scene where I looked confused or incapable, right in front of the lawyer who would prepare the incapacitation papers. I told Melanie that I felt well enough to participate in the lunch. She seemed overly satisfied with that. She helped me get dressed, chose an outfit for me, as if I were a child, and wheeled me into the living room. The table was set excessively. Lots of food, lots of decorations, lots of everything. Melanie's friends were already there, all greeting me with that fake pity people show when they think you are losing your mind. Julian arrived shortly after, a man in an expensive suit and a professional smile. Jeffrey made the introductions. He introduced Julian as a lawyer friend who was helping with some legal family matters. Julian shook my hand with measured firmness and told me he had heard a lot about me. I bet you have. The lunch began with the nervousness typical of a forced celebration. Melanie served the food, Geoffrey opened the wine, and the friends chatted about trivialities. And I watched, waiting. It did not take long for them to start. Melanie, casually, mentioned that I had been confused that morning, trying to leave the room without the wheelchair. One of the friends commented on how difficult it must be for me to accept my limitations. Another agreed, saying that her grandmother had gone through the same phase of denial when she started losing capabilities. Julian listened to everything with professional attention, asking subtle questions about my routine, my memory, my ability to make decisions. It was an interrogation disguised as a casual conversation, and everyone at the table knew it, except apparently me. That is when I decided to start my own performance. I faked confusion about where I was, asking if it was already time for Easter lunch. Melanie exchanged meaningful glances with Julian. One of the friends sighed with pity. Geoffrey kindly corrected me, saying it was Christmas, not Easter. I feigned surprise, then embarrassment. I said my foot hurt and that the medication made me dizzy. Julian discreetly wrote something in a small notebook. I continued like this throughout the meal, moments of clarity interspersed with apparent confusion. Nothing too exaggerated, just enough to feed the narrative they wanted to build. And every second was being recorded by the cameras they did not know existed. After lunch, when everyone was in the living room having coffee, pretending to celebrate, my moment arrived. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time I had agreed upon with Mitch. I got up from the wheelchair with difficulty, leaning on the crutch the doctors had given me. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. Melanie quickly got up, coming toward me with that mask of concern. That is when the doorbell rang. The silence in the room was absolute. Geoffrey and Melanie looked at each other, confused. They were not expecting anyone else. Melanie offered to get it, but I said I would go, that I should sit down. I just smiled and said I would go myself. After all, it was my house. I walked slowly to the door, leaning on the crutch, feeling all the eyes on my back. I opened the door calmly. On the other side were 2 uniformed police officers, Mitch and Dr. Arnold, my lawyer. I turned toward the living room, where everyone was frozen, processing the scene. And then I said, with a voice firmer and clearer than I had used in months, "Officers, please come in. I have a report to file." The silence that followed was dense, heavy, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I saw Melanie's face lose all colour. Her eyes widened as the police officers entered. Geoffrey stood still, mouth open, unable to formulate words. Melanie's friends looked at each other, confused. Julian, the lawyer, immediately adopted a defensive posture, closing his little notebook and crossing his arms. The commander leading the operation, Commander Smith, a man in his 50s with an imposing presence, entered the room, examining every person present. Behind him, Mitch carried a laptop, and Dr. Arnold brought a thick folder with documents. I asked permission and returned to my wheelchair, not because I needed it, but because the visual drama of the moment was worth every second. A 68-year-old lady, with a cast on her foot, the visible victim of violence, reporting her own family members on Christmas Day. It was an image that would be etched into the memory of everyone present. Commander Smith formally introduced himself and asked who Geoffrey Reynolds and Melanie Reynolds were. My son and daughter-in-law identified themselves with trembling voices. One of Melanie's friends nervously stood up, saying it might be better for them to leave, but the commander kindly asked everyone to remain seated. That is when I began to speak. My voice was firm, without hesitation, completely different from the confused woman I had been playing during lunch. I explained that in recent months I had been the victim of systematic financial diversion, totaling approximately $300,000. That my son and daughter-in-law had gained access to my accounts through a power of attorney I granted them, trusting them after my husband's death, that they had used that access to steal money from both my personal accounts and the businesses I managed. Jeffrey tried to interrupt, saying they were family loans, misunderstandings. The commander asked him to wait his turn to speak. I continued. I said that I had discovered through private investigation that they maintained a secret apartment paid for with my money, where they lived a luxury lifestyle while living in my house for free. That Melanie had a history of marrying an elderly man who conveniently died, leaving her as an heiress. That they had hired a lawyer specializing in incapacitation to have me declared mentally incompetent. Julian tried to protest, saying he did not know what I was talking about, that he was only providing legal consultation. Dr. Arnold opened the folder and took out copies of emails between Julian and Melanie, discussing exactly the procedures to have me institutionalized. The lawyer paled. But the worst, I continued, is that after they discovered I was investigating, they started planning ways to drug me to create false evidence of mental decline. And 3 days ago, my daughter-in-law deliberately pushed me down the stairs, breaking my foot. Melanie exploded. She shouted that I had fallen alone, that I was delusional, that the medication was making me paranoid. Her friends agreed, saying that I was clearly not well, that all the behavior during lunch showed confusion. That is when Mitch opened the laptop. On the large screen connected to the living room television, the recording from the external camera began to play. Everyone could see, in high definition, Melanie looking around, checking if anyone was watching. Then, with clear, deliberate movements, placing both hands on my back and pushing me forcefully. The entire room could see my fall, hear my scream of pain. And then they could see and hear Jeffrey coming out of the house, looking at me fallen and laughing. His voice came clearly from the speakers. It was to teach you a lesson, as you deserve. The silence that followed was absolute. One of Melanie's friends put her hand over her mouth, horrified. Another started to cry softly. Julian subtly moved away from Melanie, as if physical proximity could contaminate him. Melanie looked at the screen. She looked at me, looked at the police officers, processing the fact that she had been recorded. Jeffrey was white as a sheet, looking at his own hands as if he did not recognize the man who had laughed at his own mother's fall. But Mitch was not finished. He started playing other recordings. Conversations between Jeffrey and Melanie about speeding up my death. Discussions about putting medication in my food. The audio of the consultation with Julian about the incapacitation procedures. The visits to the secret apartment. Every video, every audio, was another hammer blow to the defense they would try to build. There was no way to deny it. There was no way to justify it. It was all there, recorded, dated, authenticated. When the videos ended, Commander Smith addressed Jeffrey and Melanie. He said they were being arrested in the act for intentional bodily harm in Melanie's case, and for complicity and threat in Jeffrey's case. That other crimes would be investigated, including diversion of funds, fraud, and conspiracy. Melanie tried to run. She literally tried to run out the kitchen door, but one of the officers intercepted her easily. She started screaming, saying that I had planned everything, that I had falsified the evidence, that I was trying to steal the inheritance that was theirs by right. The irony of her words was not lost on anyone in the room. Jeffrey, on the other hand, collapsed. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and started to cry. They were not tears of remorse, I realized. They were tears of self-pity, from a man who had thrown everything away for greed and lost. The officers handcuffed them. Melanie kept screaming, struggling against the handcuffs, uttering threats and insults. Jeffrey just cried in silence, his face hidden in his hands. Before taking them away, Commander Smith asked me if I wanted to say anything. I looked at my son, that man I carried, raised, loved unconditionally for 28 years. That man who laughed when he saw me fallen, injured, bleeding, and I said only one thing. You are no longer my son, not from the moment you decided I was worth more dead than alive. Jeffrey looked at me, his eyes red from crying, and tried to speak. He tried to say he was sorry, that he had been influenced, that he never wanted it to come to this. But I raised my hand, silencing him. There was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. There was no excuse, no justification, no possible forgiveness for someone who plans the death of his own mother. The officers took them away. Melanie continued screaming in the hallway, her voice echoing through the house until the patrol car door closed. Jeffrey left in silence, his head bowed, defeated. Melanie's friends hurriedly left, murmuring apologies, probably already figuring out how they would explain to other people that they had witnessed an arrest at Christmas lunch. Julian tried to leave discreetly, but Dr. Arnold intercepted him, saying that the Bar Association would be notified of his involvement in the fraud scheme. When everyone finally left and the house was silent, I found myself alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of the Christmas lunch that never became a celebration. The cold turkey on the table, the half-finished wines, the dessert plates that no one touched. Mitch stayed with me. He sat beside me and asked if I was okay. I answered honestly I did not know. Part of me felt immense relief. The threat had been neutralized, my safety was guaranteed, justice would be done. But another part of me, the part that was still a mother despite everything, ached in a way no broken bone could compare to, because even knowing that Jeffrey did not love me, even having proof of his betrayal, it was still hard to accept that I had lost my son. Not to death, but to something much worse, the greed that transformed him into a cruel stranger. Dr. Arnold returned an hour later with papers for me to sign. Documents formalizing the criminal complaint, authorizations to proceed with the full investigation, and confirmation that the new will was safely stored and protected. I signed everything with a steady hand, without hesitation. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply. Not because I was happy, but because I was safe. The monster that lived in my own house had been removed. The threat to my life was over. Tomorrow, the legal process, the hearings, the testimonies would begin. It would be long. It would be painful. It would be public. But I was ready. Because Sophia Reynolds was no longer the naive, trusting widow she had been. She was a survivor. And survivors do not give up. The days that followed Christmas were a whirlwind of legal activity and media attention that I did not expect. The story of a mother being assaulted and robbed by her own son and daughter-in-law caught the attention of local newspapers, then larger news outlets. Reporters camped outside my house, asking for interviews, wanting details. Mitch advised me not to speak to the press until the legal process was further along. Dr. Arnold agreed, saying that any public statement could be used by Jeffrey and Melanie's defense. So I remained silent, which only increased public curiosity. What we discovered in the following weeks, as the police deepened the investigation, went far beyond what I imagined. Melanie did not just have one previous husband who conveniently died. She had two. The first, whose last name she used differently at the time for reasons unknown, had been a 65-year-old businessman who died of a heart attack just 6 months after the wedding. She inherited an apartment and about $200,000. The second husband, the one I already knew about, the 72-year-old gentleman, had left even more. In total, Melanie had inherited over $1 million from two elderly husbands who died in circumstances that, although officially natural, were statistically very convenient. The police reopened both cases for investigation. They exhumed bodies, reviewed medical reports, interviewed relatives, and began to find patterns. In both cases, the men had been healthy until they met Melanie. After the marriage, they rapidly developed heart problems, uncontrolled high blood pressure, and episodes of confusion that resulted in falls and accidents. A toxicologist was called to review the old forensic reports. He pointed out that the symptoms were consistent with gradual poisoning by certain medications that, in small regular doses, would cause exactly the problems Melanie's husbands developed. They were substances difficult to detect in routine autopsies, especially when doctors already expected to find heart problems due to age. When they told me this, a chill ran down my spine, because I realized how close I had been to being the third victim. If I had not discovered the plan in time, if I had not stopped eating the food Melanie prepared, perhaps my obituary would now be in the newspapers as a natural death from health complications. Jeffrey was also being investigated more thoroughly. They discovered that he had gambling debts that he hid from me. Almost $100,000 owed to loan sharks, contracted even before meeting Melanie. When Melanie entered his life with inheritance money, she must have seemed like the perfect solution. And when her money ran out, I became the next target. The district attorney built a strong case. Charges of aggravated assault for Melanie, fraud for both, conspiracy, and for Julian, the lawyer, participation in a fraud scheme. The sentences, if convicted, could reach 15 years for Melanie and 10 for Jeffrey. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for February. Dr. Arnold prepared me extensively. He said I would be called to testify, that the defense would try to discredit me, painting me as a vengeful and controlling mother who fabricated accusations because she could not accept that her son had grown up and started his own family. When the day arrived, I was nervous but prepared. The courthouse was packed. Part of Melanie's family, who believed in her innocence, occupied half the seats. The other half was filled with onlookers and journalists. I entered leaning on crutches, my foot still in a cast, serving as a visual reminder of the violence I suffered. Jeffrey and Melanie were already there, seated with their lawyers. Jeffrey looked at me when I entered, and for the first time, I saw something close to real shame in his eyes. Melanie, on the other hand, stared at me with pure hatred. There were no more masks, no more the sweet, attentive daughter-in-law. It was just naked, raw rage. The judge, Dr. Henry Collins, a man in his 60s with a reputation for severity, opened the session. He asked the prosecution to present the case. Dr. Patricia Mendez, the appointed prosecutor, was a competent woman in her 40s who had experience in crimes against the elderly. She presented the case meticulously. She showed the financial evidence, the diversions, the never-repaid loans, the secret apartment. She presented the audio recordings of the conversations about accelerating my death, about drugging me, about obtaining fraudulent guardianship. And finally, she played the video of the assault on the stairs. The entire room watched in silence as the recording showed Melanie shoving me and Jeffrey laughing, saying it was a lesson I deserved. I saw some people in the audience shaking their heads in disapproval. An older woman, whom I later discovered was Melanie's aunt, started crying softly. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with difficulty. The judge offered for me to remain seated throughout the testimony, given my physical condition. I accepted gratefully. Dr. Patricia asked me direct questions. When did I discover the diversions? How did I feel hearing my son and daughter-in-law planning my death? What happened on the stairs on December 22nd? I answered everything calmly, without dramatization, just recounting the facts. I explained that I had trusted them completely, that I had given my son power of attorney after my husband's death, because I believed he would help me, that I never imagined that trust would be used to systematically rob me. I told about the morning I overheard the conversation, about the coldness with which they discussed how much longer I would live, about the fear I felt when I realized I was not safe in my own home, and finally, about the shove, about the physical and emotional pain of being deliberately assaulted by my daughter-in-law while my son approved. When I finished, tears were streaming down my face. They were not planned. They were not a performance. It was real pain, real grief for the family I thought I had, and discovered was an illusion. Melanie's lawyer, Dr. Charles Foster, an aggressive man known for intimidation tactics, began the cross-examination. He tried to paint me as controlling, asking if I had difficulty accepting that Jeffrey was an adult and had a right to his own life. If it was possible that my interpretation of the conversations I overheard was distorted by my emotional state after becoming a widow. I replied patiently that being in mourning did not make me deaf or incapable of understanding clear English. That hearing someone say, "When is the old lady going to die and we cannot wait 30 years?" left no room for interpretation. He then suggested that perhaps I had fallen alone on the stairs, and in my confused state, documented by the witnesses at lunch, I had fabricated a false narrative of assault, that the video only showed Melanie near me, not necessarily pushing me. Dr. Patricia immediately objected, asking for the video to be played again, frame by frame, and there, for everyone to see, it was clear. Melanie's hands extended on my back, pushing with enough force to move my entire body forward. There was no ambiguity, no alternative interpretation. It was clear and deliberate assault. Jeffrey's lawyer, a younger man named Dr. Robert Acosta, tried a different approach. He suggested that my son had been manipulated by Melanie, that she was the true criminal, that Jeffrey was essentially another victim, seduced by a calculating woman who had a history of exploiting elderly people. I looked at Jeffrey when the lawyer said that. My son kept his eyes down, neither confirming nor denying. Part of me wanted to believe that narrative, wanted to think that my boy had been deceived, manipulated, led astray by a malicious influence. But then I remembered the laugh, the way he had laughed when he saw me fallen, bleeding with a broken foot, the way he said I deserved that lesson. That was not manipulation. That was cruelty that came from within him, from a dark place that perhaps was always there, and I never wanted to see. When the judge asked if I had anything else to state before concluding my testimony, I requested permission to speak directly to my son. The judge hesitated, but finally consented. I looked at Jeffrey. He finally raised his eyes and stared at me. And I said, with a voice that came out firmer than I expected, "Jeffrey, for 28 years I loved you unconditionally. I gave you everything I could: love, education, opportunities, trust. When your father died, you were the most important person in my life, and you took all that and turned it into a weapon against me. Not out of necessity, not out of desperation, but out of pure greed. You stole from me, you betrayed me, you laughed at my pain. So no, you are not a victim of anyone but your own choices, and you will have to live with them for the rest of your life." Jeffrey started to cry. They were no longer tears of self-pity, I realized. They were tears of someone who finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. Not the money, not the inheritance, but something much more precious: the love of his own mother. The judge ended my participation and called other witnesses. Robert, my accountant, confirmed the financial diversions with detailed documentation. Mitch presented the full results of his investigation. Even neighbors were called to testify about changes in my behavior, confirming that I was always lucid and capable, disproving the narrative of mental decline that Melanie and Jeffrey tried to build. The toxicologist who reviewed the cases of Melanie's previous husbands also testified, presenting analyses that strongly suggested gradual poisoning. The defense tried to discredit his conclusions, but the evidence was technical, scientific, difficult to refute. The hearing lasted 3 full days. In the end, the judge determined there was sufficient cause for a full trial. He denied bail for Melanie, citing flight risk and risk to witnesses, especially me. For Jeffrey, he granted a high bail, $500,000, which he had no way to pay. Both would remain imprisoned until the trial. When I left the courthouse that last day, journalists surrounded me. This time, Mitch and Dr. Arnold agreed that I could speak. Not much, just a brief statement. I looked at the cameras and said, "I trusted the wrong people because they were family. I paid dearly for that trust, but I am not going to let what happened to me happen to others. If anyone is going through something similar, hearing strange conversations, noticing money disappearing, feeling manipulated by their own family, do not ignore the signs. Seek help, because family is not who shares your blood. Family is who respects your life." The statement was played on several news channels. I received hundreds of messages from people telling similar stories, thanking me for having the courage to speak. Some called me an inspiration. I did not feel inspiring. I felt tired, hurt, but also determined to see this through to the end. The trial was scheduled for May, 4 months later. Meanwhile, my life slowly began to rebuild. The cast came off. I started physical therapy, regained mobility, returned to personally managing the bakeries, reconnected with friends I had neglected, and started living again. The house, which had been invaded by Jeffrey and Melanie's toxic presence, became mine again. I redecorated the room they used, transforming it into an office. I removed everything that reminded me of them, every photo, every object. It was painful, but necessary. My younger sister, Clara, who lived in Denver, came to spend a week with me. She hugged me tight when she arrived and said she was sorry she had not noticed what was happening. I explained that I myself had not realized it for a long time, that manipulators are skilled at hiding their true intentions. We spent that week talking, remembering our childhood, our family, the parents who had already passed. Clara reminded me of the strong woman I always was, before mourning and loneliness made me vulnerable. She said that Sophia was coming back, and she was right. When May finally arrived, I was ready to face Jeffrey and Melanie in court, ready to tell my complete story, ready to see justice served. The trial would be long, maybe weeks, but I would not run away. I would not give up, because this was not just about me. It was about all the elderly people who are exploited, abused, and manipulated by those who should protect them. It was about proving that being elderly does not mean being weak, and that Sophia Reynolds was not a victim. She was a survivor. The trial began on a rainy Monday in May. The courthouse was even more packed than at the preliminary hearing. The case had gained national notoriety, becoming an example of how families can become dangerous when money is involved. Melanie entered the room with a completely different look. Hair tied back, no makeup, simple clothes. It was clearly a defense strategy to make her look less threatening, more vulnerable. But her eyes, when they met mine, still burned with that icy hatred. Jeffrey was thinner, paler, with deep, dark circles under his eyes. The months in prison had taken their toll. He did not look at me when he entered, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. I do not know if it was shame or cowardice, perhaps both. Dr. Patricia, the prosecutor, opened with a devastating summary of the case. She presented the complete timeline from my husband's death, through the financial diversions, the recorded conversations, culminating in the physical assault. She painted a picture of systematic predators who had chosen a vulnerable widow as their target. When it was the defense's turn, Melanie's lawyer attempted a risky strategy. He admitted she had made mistakes, but argued that everything had been for love of Jeffrey, that she was a devoted wife trying to help her husband solve financial problems. that the shove had been an accident, a moment of frustration where she merely extended her hand, and I, unbalanced by age and medication, fell. The narrative would have been convincing if it were not for the video, Doctor. Patricia played it again, this time with analysis from a body language expert who pointed out every detail. Melanie checking for witnesses, positioning herself strategically behind me, the deliberate movement of her arms, the force applied. There was no ambiguity. It was premeditated assault. Jeffrey's lawyer, on the other hand, maintained the line that he was a victim of manipulation. He presented witnesses who spoke about what Jeffrey was like before meeting Melanie, a hard-working young man, a good son, with no criminal history. They suggested that Melanie, with experience manipulating older people, had seduced and corrupted a vulnerable young man with gambling debts. It was partially true. Jeffrey had debts before meeting Melanie, but that did not explain the laugh. It did not explain the cruel words. It did not explain the active complicity at every stage of the plan. He was not a puppet. He was a conscious accomplice. Over the course of 2 weeks, witness after witness was called. The toxicologist explained in technical detail how Melanie's previous husbands were likely poisoned. Relatives of those men testified about sudden behavioral changes after the marriages, about Melanie isolating the husbands from relatives, about convenient deaths that resulted in substantial inheritances. Robert presented financial documentation that left no doubt about the systematic diversions. Mitch described his investigation, the photos of the secret apartment, the meetings with Julian. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the wall surrounding Jeffrey and Melanie, eliminating any possibility of innocence. Julian, the corrupt lawyer, had cut a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for testifying against Melanie and Jeffrey, he would receive a reduced sentence. His testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Melanie specifically sought him out, asking for help to obtain fraudulent guardianship of a rich, senile mother-in-law. He recounted that Melanie had asked for referrals for doctors willing to provide false evaluations, for witnesses who could be bought, that the plan was to declare me incompetent, gain full control of the finances, and then, using his words, wait for nature to take its course, with or without help. That last part caused a commotion in the room. The judge had to call for order because Julian had essentially confirmed that Melanie was planning my death, whether by waiting for it to happen naturally or by accelerating the process. When it was my turn to testify again, this time in the full trial, I walked to the stand with a firm step. My foot had fully healed, although I still felt pain on rainy days. But I no longer needed crutches, no longer showed physical fragility. I wanted the jury to see me as I was, a perfectly capable, lucid, strong 68-year-old woman. Dr. Patricia guided me through the whole story again. This time, I could speak more freely, adding emotional details that had been omitted in the preliminary hearing. I talked about what it was like to hear my son and daughter-in-law discussing my death for the first time, how that broke something inside me that would never be fully repaired. I spoke about the fear of eating the food Melanie prepared, about sleeping with the door locked in my own house, about living in a constant state of alert, about how every smile from them, every word of affection, was like a stab because I knew it was false. And I spoke about the stairs, about the second before the shove, when our eyes met, and I saw in Melanie's pupils not sudden rage, but cold, calculated intent, about the physical pain of the bone breaking. Yes, but mainly about the emotional pain of understanding that my own son, my flesh and blood, had approved that violence against me. When I finished, there were jurors crying discreetly. Some avoided looking at Jeffrey and Melanie, as if their presence were contaminating. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyers tried to destabilize me, suggesting I was a controlling mother who could not accept losing power over her adult son, that I was using my financial resources as a weapon of manipulation, that I had misinterpreted innocent conversations through the filter of a paranoid, lonely widow. I answered every attack calmly. I presented facts, not emotions, bank numbers, not hurt feelings, clear recordings, not subjective interpretations. It was impossible to discredit such solid evidence, but they tried. At one point, Melanie's lawyer made a mistake. He asked if I did not think I was being dramatic, that a simple fall down the stairs did not justify destroying the lives of two young people with imprisonment. I looked at him and replied, "A simple fall? My foot was fractured in 2 places. I needed surgery with metal pins. I was incapacitated for weeks. And you heard the video. The assault was not the fall. It was the deliberate shove that caused the fall, and my son's words saying I deserved that. None of that is simple. None of that is accidental. It was premeditated violence against a 68-year-old woman by people who should be protecting me." The jury looked at me with expressions that mixed pity and rage. Pity for me, rage for Jeffrey and Melanie. It was exactly the reaction the truth deserved to provoke. The trial dragged on for 3 weeks. More witnesses, more evidence, more arguments. The defense brought psychologists trying to explain how good people could do bad things under financial pressure. The prosecution brought specialists in crimes against the elderly, showing patterns of behavior that Jeffrey and Melanie followed almost like a manual. Finally, the day of the closing arguments arrived. Dr. Patricia gave a powerful speech about how society fails to protect the elderly, about how family trust is often used as a weapon, about how justice needed to be done, not just for me, but to send a clear message that this type of crime would not be tolerated. The defense lawyers made their final efforts, asking for clemency, talking about youth and second chances, about how a long prison sentence would be disproportionate to the crime. But their voices sounded weak against the weight of the evidence. The jury retired for deliberation on a Friday afternoon. They said it could take days. I went home, emotionally exhausted, and waited. Clara had returned and stayed with me, keeping me company, distracting me with conversations about anything other than the trial. The verdict arrived on Monday morning. The court called me, saying the jury had reached a decision. My heart raced. 3 days was a relatively short time, which usually indicated that the decision had been clear, not controversial. I returned to the courthouse with Clara by my side. The room was tense, silent. Melanie stared straight ahead, her face an empty mask. Jeffrey nervously bit his lips, his hands trembling even in handcuffs. The judge entered and asked everyone to stand. The jury foreman, a woman in her 50s with a serious expression, stood with the verdict paper in her hands. Regarding the crime of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Melanie Reynolds, guilty. I felt Clara squeeze my hand. Regarding the crime of fraud, we find the defendants, Melanie Reynolds and Jeffrey Reynolds, guilty. Regarding the crime of conspiracy, we find the defendants, Melanie Reynolds and Jeffrey Reynolds, guilty. Guilty on all counts. The jury had had no doubts. Melanie remained motionless, but I saw a tear roll down her face. Not out of remorse, I realized, but out of rage at being caught. Jeffrey lowered his head and began to sob softly. The judge then moved to sentencing. For Melanie, 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole before serving half the sentence. For Jeffrey, 8 years, with the possibility of parole after 1/3 served, given that he partially cooperated with the investigation and had no prior criminal record. 12 years, 8 years. They were heavy sentences, but fair. Melanie would be almost 40 when she got out. Jeffrey would be 36. Their lives at least as they knew them, were over. Part of me felt a pang of pain seeing my son being led away by the officers again, that maternal instinct that never completely dies, regardless of what the child does. But the greater part of me felt relief. Justice had been served. The nightmare was over. Outside the courthouse, I gave another brief interview. I thanked the judicial system for hearing me, for taking the case seriously, for understanding that crimes against the elderly are as serious as any other. I said I hoped my story would encourage others in the same situation not to be afraid to report, even when the abusers are family. Today, 1.5 years after that Christmas that changed everything, I am sitting on my balcony having breakfast. The sun is warm, typical of December in Los Angeles, and I can hear the street noise starting the day. The bakeries are thriving under my renewed management. I hired a trusted manager for the day-to-day, but I actively participate in important decisions. I discovered that being forced back into total control of the businesses gave me an energy I had not had in years. The house is different, lighter. I redecorated almost everything, bringing in brighter colors, new furniture, plants that I let Clara take care of when I travel. Yes, I started traveling again. I went to Miami earlier this year, something Richard and I always planned to do but never did. It was bittersweet to do it alone, but also liberating. I made new friends through a support group for people who suffered financial and emotional abuse from relatives. It is surprising and sad how many similar stories there are. Children who see their parents as living banks, daughters-in-law and sons-in-law who plan inheritances before death, grandchildren who manipulate vulnerable grandparents. I became a kind of mentor in the group, helping others recognize the signs to protect themselves legally and financially. The will I made remains valid. Ryan, my nephew, will be the main beneficiary when I pass, along with the Foundation for Underprivileged Children. Jeffrey will still receive the symbolic $100,000, not out of generosity, but so it is legally clear that he was not forgotten, just consciously excluded from the majority of the inheritance. I have not visited Jeffrey in prison. He wrote to me 3 times, long letters, asking for forgiveness, explaining how he got lost, how Melanie manipulated him, but acknowledging that he was still responsible for his own choices. I did not reply to the first 2. The third one I received last week, and it is still on the living room table, unopened. Part of me wants to read it, wants to know what he has to say after a year of reflecting on his actions. Another part of me sees no point. Words will not change what happened. They will not bring back the lost time, the broken trust, the pain I carry. Perhaps one day I will open the letter. Perhaps one day when he gets out of prison, we can have some kind of distant, civilized relationship. Not as mother and son, that died the moment he laughed at my fall, but perhaps as 2 people who share a history and are trying to move forward. But not today. Today is still too recent, too painful. Today I prefer to focus on what I built, on the friendships I cultivated, on the life I recovered. Melanie, according to Dr. Arnold, who maintains contact with the prosecution, is having a difficult time in prison. Apparently, her ability to manipulate people does not work so well when everyone around her are criminals who recognize other criminals. I feel a small and perhaps petty satisfaction with that. The investigations into her previous husbands continue. There are real possibilities that murder charges will be formally filed. If that happens, she will never leave prison. It will be where she should be, far from vulnerable people she could exploit. Sometimes, late at night, I still have nightmares. I dream I am falling down the stairs again, that I wake up and they are still in the house, that I discover too late that I was poisoned. I wake up sweating, heart pounding, and I need a few minutes to remember that I am safe, that they are in prison, that the danger has passed. The therapist I started seeing a few months ago says it is normal, that trauma takes time to process, that the nightmares will eventually decrease. I am starting to believe her. The nightmares are already less frequent than they were at first. What did I learn from all this? That trust is precious and should be given with care, even to family. Especially to family, perhaps because that is where we have the most to lose when we are betrayed. That being elderly does not mean being weak or incapable, and that we must not let anyone make us feel that way. I learned that it is possible to rebuild life after destruction, that it is possible to find strength even when all seems lost, that justice, although delayed, still exists, and that surviving is not just continuing to exist, it is choosing to live fully, despite what they tried to do to you. I look at the scars on my foot, still visible where the pins were inserted. Some people might see those scars as a reminder of victimization. I see them as a reminder of survival, of struggle, of victory. Sophia Reynolds is no longer the naive widow who trusted blindly. She is no longer the mother who put her son above everything, even her own safety. She is a woman who looked betrayal in the face, fought against it, and won. And if my story can help just one person recognize the signs of abuse, have the courage to report, and protect themselves before it is too late, then all the suffering will have been worth it. Because in the end, it is not about the money they tried to steal. It is not about the inheritance they planned. It is about dignity, about the right to live without fear in your own home, about justice when family members turn into predators, and about proving that 68-year-old widows with broken feet can be more dangerous and resilient than 30-something criminals imagine. I finish my coffee, get up, and start my day. I have a meeting at the bakery, lunch with Clara, a painting class in the afternoon. Normal life, good life, my life. And that is exactly how it should be. The nightmare is over. Life goes on. And I, Sophia Reynolds, am more alive than ever. Now, if you liked this story, click to subscribe. And tell me in the comments what part left your jaw dropping. Oh, and do not forget to become a member to get access to exclusive videos that I do not post here. I will see you there.